Sociology of crime. Let me ask you a question. What percent of the population do you think becomes a victim of a serious crime each year? By serious crime, I mean something you'd usually report to the police, such as a robbery, rape, a home break-in, or a physical assault. When I ask students this question in my face-to-face classes, most students guess the annual risk of crime victimization hovers between 30 to 50%, meaning they believe that 1/3 to 1/2 of people will be seriously victimized each and every single year. Luckily, it's way lower than that. About 15% of U.S. adults admit to being the victim of a crime each year. A subset of those, between 1 to 3%, admit to being the victim of a violent crime. That data come from one of the U.S.'s largest and most respected polling firms, the Gallup organization. And it's not just Gallup. Other large random sample surveys conducted by national law enforcement agencies tend to find similar percentages. It's important to note that these data are taken from surveys, not formal police reports. Interestingly, one of the best ways of tracking crime is to call samples of people directly and simply ask them. This is because only a percentage of those crimes committed each year will ever be reported to the police. Gallup derives these statistics by asking people about their experience with 7 general types of crime: home break-ins, car thefts, property or money theft, vandalism, muggings, physical assaults, rape and sexual assaults, or robbery by force or threat of force. Some of these are what we call property crimes, like theft or vandalism. Others are violent crimes. Violent crimes include crimes like mugging or robbery by force or threat of force, physical assault, and rape or sexual assault. For something to be classified as a violent crime, by the way, you don't need to actually be hurt. If someone just threatens to harm you if you don't give them your wallet, even if they never touch you, that's still considered a violent crime. Homicide is also a violent crime, of course, and probably the most serious, but it isn't included in the survey data like these at all, because you can't call someone up and ask if they got murdered in the last year. So there are other ways of tracking data on that, which we'll talk about in the next slide. Some people in the Gallup data set were more likely to be victimized than others, by the way. The poorest households, those making under $30,000 annually, had higher victimization rates than wealthier ones. Young adults had higher victimization rates than elderly people did, and people living in big cities were more likely to be victimized than those living in rural areas. Traditionally, crime statistics, including those I just cited, don't track all crimes, or even all crimes reported to the police. Instead, they focused on tracking so-called index crimes. The FBI's Uniform Crime Report, in use from 1960 till 2021, tracked reported incidents of 8 crimes. Violent crimes including murder, non-negligent homicide, meaning willful killing of another person, rape, robbery, and aggravated assault, and property crimes consisting of burglary, larceny theft, which includes both stealing and knowingly trafficking in stolen goods, motor vehicle theft, and arson. These types of offenses are sometimes also called street crimes, aka public or blue-collar crimes, because they often occur in public places, on a dark street as you walk home from a club, for example, and are associated in many people's minds with so-called stereotypical criminals, working-class or lower-income offenders, often young and often male. And yes, that is extremely biased. Of course, not all such crimes are committed by those kind of offenders, or committed on the street at all. Aggravated assault and rape are common across economic classes, for example, and most rapes occur between people who know each other, not between strangers in dark alleyways. One obvious problem with the index crime system and its focus on so-called street crime is that it traditionally undercounted or ignored other types of crime completely. What we call white-collar crimes in particular tended not to be included in overall crime statistics. White-collar crimes are those culturally associated with upper-class or higher-income criminals. Criminologist Edwin Sutherland defined white-collar crime as, quote, a crime committed by a person of high social standing during the course of their occupation. White-collar crimes range from financial offenses like fraud or embezzlement, stealing money from a company you work for or its customers, to hurting or even killing consumers by knowingly selling unsafe products. By the way, that's where the term white-collar comes from, an era when office-working men wore suits and ties with starched white collars. The term blue-collar, in contrast, connoted a working man, someone who wore a denim work shirt or uniform to work in a factory, gas station, or construction site. Despite the fact that they happen in offices and not dark alleyways, white-collar crimes are often just as serious and injurious as street crimes. White-collar crimes, according to the FBI, cost the U.S. and its citizens more than $300 billion annually. It's interesting, then, that a mugging, which may result in a victim losing the $40 in his wallet, would be counted in traditional crime statistics, whereas a fraud that caused that same victim to lose $500,000 in retirement savings may not have been. However, at the time of this recording, the FBI is transitioning to a new reporting system, the National Incident-Based Reporting System, NIBRS, which includes a broader range of crime. For example, certain types of computer or cyber crimes, drug-related offenses, gambling and prostitution, as well as many categories of white-collar crimes. Okay, we've covered a little bit about why measuring crime is more complicated than it looks, but let's talk about justice for victims. Let's say you've become the victim of a serious crime. What do you do next? In order for the person who hurt or stole from you to be caught, prosecuted, and punished, you first have to report the crime by calling the police. Surprisingly, a lot of people don't, and the story ends there. So that's my next question. What percentage of victims of violent crimes would you guess call the police? What percentage of victims of property crimes? If you guessed less than half for both, you'd be right. This is a reason knowing what percent of the population is the victim of a crime in any given year can be challenging, because not all crimes are reported to the police. And it's also why we tend to rely on direct dial surveys, like the National Crime Victimization Survey conducted by the U.S. Bureau of Justice, where the data on this slide are pulled from, or polls by big polling firms like Gallup. Surveys such as these show us that less than half of all violent and property crimes, again excluding murder, are reported to the police each year. Of all violent crimes, only about 41% were reported, with aggravated assault being the most likely to be reported. The FBI defines aggravated assault as an unlawful attack by one person upon another for the purpose of inflicting severe or aggravated bodily injury. This is another one of those crimes that doesn't require the victim to actually be injured. Just displaying or threatening someone with a weapon can result in an ag assault charge, because if the weapon were to be used, serious bodily injury would occur. Simple assault describes a similar offense but without the use of weapons, or with an attack resulting in more minor injuries, either actual or threatened. Robbery is a crime in which a theft or attempted theft is accomplished through force or the threat of force. Of violent crimes, rape or sexual assault have some of the lowest reporting rates. For rape, it tends to be higher in cases of stranger rape, and much lower in cases of acquaintance rape, although acquaintance rape is far more common. Property crimes are also underreported, and often even more so. There are many reasons why a victim might not call the police. Some feel police will not take the crime seriously or will be unable to solve it. This may especially be the case for thefts of possessions that are of lower monetary value. You'll note that stolen cars are usually reported. This is in part because they're more likely to be insured, and claiming compensation requires a police report. Some people fear police contact. Undocumented immigrants or other vulnerable populations may not wish to involve the police due to fear of being arrested. Others may be worried that when the police show up, they will be hurt themselves, as in the case of Sonia Massey, an Illinois woman who was fatally shot in her home in 2024 after calling 911. Some victims feel shame or fear of disclosing what happened to them, especially a problem with sexual assault survivors, and some may fear retribution from their attacker. By the way, let's talk about homicide for a minute. It's not included in the stats on the previous page because those are survey data and you can't ask people whether they've been recently murdered. Luckily, this most serious of crimes is rare relative to other violent crimes. In 2021, the FBI reported a total of 21,570 homicides in the United States, or about 7.8 homicides per 100,000 people in our population. Our homicide rate jumped during the COVID-19 pandemic, about 39% in 2020 compared to 2019, which had 16,669 reported murders. We don't entirely know why this increase happened, especially as other types of crime continued to fall, though it's possible the social disruptions wrought by the COVID-19 pandemic played some role. For example, though many other types of crimes decreased, incidents of reported domestic violence did increase. In Harris County, Texas, home of Houston, reported incidences of domestic violence during the lockdown period increased 27%. For victims, being stuck at home with their abuser, the loss of job income that may have made escape more possible, and a lack of access to other kinds of social support increased risk. There are two bits of relatively good news. Even though the murder rate rose during the pandemic, it was still well below the far higher homicide rates we saw in decades past. In the chart on the right, you can note those big spikes in the murder rate during the 70s, 80s, and 90s. We'll talk about those later. Also, it dropped again in recent years. the time of this recording, FBI stats noted that homicide rate was back on the decline and trending downwards. Also, though the pandemic-era figure of 21,000 murders a year is terrible, considering our population size of approximately 330 million people, the average person's annual odds of being a homicide victim are still very low. But let's get back to our hypothetical. You are the victim of a crime, and you're among that population of less than half of crime victims annually who decided it would be a good idea to call the police. What are your odds of seeing someone arrested in your case? This is referred to as the clearance rate, whether a report leads to an arrest. This doesn't mean the person gets convicted or does jail time, by the way. It doesn't necessarily even mean they were guilty. A case is considered cleared by the police if someone was arrested and charged. Clearance also includes cases cleared by quote-unquote exceptional means, meaning the police are confident they know who did it and have enough evidence to lead to an arrest, but the suspect cannot be arrested for some other reason, usually because they're dead. Here we see another dramatic drop-off. Less than half of all crimes are reported, and of those, less than half of all reported crimes lead to an arrest or charge. Of violent crimes, the clearance rate is about 45.5%. For property crimes, it's less than 20%. Though again, it varies by offense. Murder and non-negligent homicide are the most likely to be cleared, with a clearance rate of about 61%, whereas property crimes have lower clearance rates. These are just arrests, though. What percentage of these end in a conviction in court, or a plea, meaning the defendant pleads guilty? What percentage of arrests, would you guess, lead to some kind of conviction? Here your odds are a little better. Approximately 68% of felony charges result in a conviction. Motor vehicle theft has the highest conviction rate, about 74%, but murder is up there at about 70%. Assault is among the lowest at about 45%. Most cases that do not end in a conviction are resolved by being dismissed. Straight-up acquittal after a trial is rarer. In fact, trials are relatively rare outcomes in the criminal justice system, even though they're absolutely ubiquitous in police TV shows and movies. 94% of state-level felony charges and 97% of federal-level felony charges are resolved through a guilty plea or a plea bargain. Plea bargains often result in a defendant taking a lesser charge or lighter sentence in exchange for pleading guilty. That way, they save the state money compared to putting on a trial. Regardless, as you can see, if you are the victim of a crime, the odds that you will see what we think of as justice, the crime being reported, and then the person responsible being investigated, arrested, convicted, and then punished, gets smaller with each step along the way. But here's another question for you, and this gets back to your general safety. In the past 30 years, would you guess crime rates have gotten worse, i.e., crime has increased? Have they gotten better, i.e., crime has gone down? Or have they stayed about the same? If you thought that crime had gone up, you aren't alone. A majority of people polled every year say they believe that crime is just continuously getting worse. But they're mostly wrong. Nationally, both violent and property crime rates have gone down since a high in the early 1990s. So why do we tend to assume things are getting worse? When surveyed, for example, approximately 71% of Americans say they believe crime in the United States is getting worse, even as it's trending in the opposite direction. But wait, didn't you just say that the homicide rate rose during the pandemic? So how can the crime rate be falling? Well, that's true. The homicide rate did rise during the pandemic, though it's fallen again since. But remember, it is possible for one kind of crime to spike, even as crime rates in general are falling, especially if that kind of crime makes up a very tiny minority of all crimes. This chart shows the total violent crime rate in blue over the course of the last 36 years, and the murder rate is plotted on the orange line underneath. You can barely see the murder rate even moving when you visualize it like this. So yeah, so long as the numbers of more common violent crimes, simple and aggravated assault, robberies, and so on are falling, the murder rate can still climb and not have that much of an effect on the overall crime rate. By the way, your odds of being the victim of a violent crime also vary depending on what country you live in. Though most of this lecture focuses on the United States, it's helpful to look at international comparison too. This chart shows the murder rate across wealthy countries, or a sample of them. The rate takes population size differences into account, by the way. It's the number of murders per 100,000 people in the population of that country. And so it's a good way to measure your likelihood of becoming a victim of a murder in a high population country like the United States compared to a lower population country like Canada. Wealthy countries tend to have lower homicide rates than poor developing countries do. Europe, a very wealthy region, has a lower homicide rate, 2.2 murders annually per 100,000 people living there, than Africa, a very poor region, with a higher murder rate of about 12.7 murders annually per 100,000 people in the population. But the richest country in the entire world, the United States, is an exception to this rule. Our murder rate is very high when compared against other wealthy countries. The United States has about 6.4 murders per 100,000 people in our population in 2021, compared even to Canada, our neighbor to the north, with only 2.3 per 100,000 people in their population. We don't have the highest murder rate on Earth, not even close. South Africa has about 46 murders annually per 100,000 in the population, Honduras about 35, and Mexico about 26. But it's not really fair to compare the United States with poor countries like Honduras. Generally, you want to compare the United States with peer nations, other wealthy, industrialized nations with functioning governments, legal systems, and police forces. However, it's really just homicides where our crime rate is higher than peer nations' crime rates. We have similar rates of car theft, burglary, and simple assault as other peer nations. So, why is that? What makes the United States a place where, among rich countries at least, people are more likely to die as a result of being murdered? This is a question we will explore in other modules. For this module, though, one of the big takeaways is this, and it's overall good news. If you're a citizen of the United States, your overall crime rate has fallen. Here you can see the spikes in the 1970s, 1980s, and early 1990s, and the steady decline since. Why? What made this happen? What makes the crime rate rise and fall? Why was the overall crime rate so high through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and why has it fallen since? By the way, we aren't the only country where this has happened. Looking at annual crime rates over time, we see the same trend of crime peaking in the early 1990s and declining in Canada, England, and Wales. So why is this? Whatever factor led our crime rates to peak through the 80s, 70s, 80s, and 90s and fall thereafter is something that likely the United States shares with a lot of our neighboring nations. People often assume crime is rising when it is not. Our media may be partially to blame for this misconception. Our media are really violent, and as a culture, we are kind of obsessed with crime. Crime is king in entertainment media. We love shows, movies, books, podcasts, and internet content about crime. The bloodier the better. Crime procedural shows like NCIS are among the most watched TV shows on Earth. But even our news media, which is supposed to reflect our reality, over-focuses on crime. In 2013, the Pew Research Group released a study showing that crime coverage accounted for close to 30% of all news content. Some of this is also down to the changing nature of news over the past decades. More of us get our news now from national or international outlets than in the past. In the 1950s, if you lived in New York and a child went missing in California, or there was an exceptionally nasty murder in Florida, you might not even hear about it. And you certainly didn't have access to hours of coverage about it, or a constant scroll of updates on your internet feeds. Even the most sensational crimes back then, and there were sensational crimes, just took up less of your attention. The fictional world has also gotten more violent, and more explicitly so. The American Association of Pediatrics released a study showing that violence in films more than doubled between 1950 and 2013, and gun violence in PG-13 rated films tripled since 1985. In 2024, 80% of the top-selling video games contain some kind of violent content, and about 85% of teenagers report playing video games. Some people blame violent criminal behavior on exposure to violent media, but if media violence caused real-world violence, we might expect to see a positive correlation between the two, i.e., we might expect that as media violence increased, real-world violence would increase too. Instead, we see the opposite. The story as to what causes violent or criminal behavior is more complicated than that. Media violence can help us explain why Americans believe the crime rate is going up when it's going in the opposite direction, though. In the 1980s, media researcher George Gerbner published work showing a correlation between how much TV subjects watched and how likely they were to overestimate their likelihood of falling victim to a violent crime. Gerbner found that excessive TV viewing caused people to believe the world was a more dangerous place than it really was, and to assume that their odds of being hurt were higher. He also found that heavy TV watchers engaged in more protective measures. These were the people who carried pepper spray everywhere and had 6 locks on their front door. Maybe you know someone like this. That elderly family member who sits in front of the news all day and is also convinced the neighbors on both sides are serial killers. Grimner called this mean world syndrome. Stated most simply, he argued that exposure to media violence may not cause us to be more violent, but it does cause us to become more scared. But yes, okay, the crime rate is falling overall. And why? Why is it so much lower now than it was in the 1990s? This question is a big one, maybe the biggest one in criminology, because criminology is all about trying to figure out why some people follow the law and some people don't. What personal factors impact that, but more pressingly, what social factors do. If we could figure out why crime rises and falls, we could do more to prevent it from happening. One super popular and widely held theory is the economy. The Greek philosopher Aristotle famously opined that poverty was the mother of crime. Indeed, the two have a long and extensively observed relationship. Many very smart people automatically assume that poverty rates, unemployment rates, etc., will tightly correlate with crime rates. That as poverty or unemployment rates rise, the crime rate will rise too. It should make sense. Growing up in poverty is a risk factor for aging into crime, and being poor raises your odds of being a crime victim, unfortunately. However, it doesn't work like that. Crime rates do not predictably rise during periods of economic downturn or high unemployment. And that's totally counterintuitive, because if everyone is suddenly losing their job, you'd expect more people would turn to crime, either to make ends meet or perhaps out of stress and frustration. But there just isn't a strong and predictable correlation. This same chart of the violent crime rate over time that I already showed you illustrates that. Crime was high in the 1980s and 1990s, which were periods of relative economic affluence, but the crime rate fell during and after the 2008 recession, and even, for most index crimes anyway, during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. The Great Depression, a period of severe, widespread poverty and unemployment, actually had relatively low crime rates. So while being a poor person puts you at higher risk of victimization, and growing up in poverty puts you at higher risk of aging into crime as an adult, the crime rate doesn't automatically shoot upwards when the stock market crashes or people start getting laid off. Sometimes it even does the opposite. Another theory that might help to explain changes in the crime rate is population demographics. Demographics refer to the statistical characteristics of a human population, its average age, its birth and death rates, and so on. Demographics aren't always as exciting an explanation for social phenomenon, but they often explain a lot. For example, men account for about 80% of violent crime arrests annually and about 63% of property crime arrests. Young people in general are another high-risk group when it comes to crime. The risk of arrest or offense for so-called street crime, both property and violent crimes, peaks at about 17 to 18 years of age and slowly declines thereafter. So the more young people, and specifically young men, there are in a population, the higher the crime rate will tend to be. During the 1970s and after, the U.S. population as a whole simply had more young people in it, an account of the big post-World War II birth cohorts like the baby boomers. By the turn of the millennium, though, the U.S. population had begun to skew older as all those post-war babies hit middle age. Middle-aged and older people just don't commit as many crimes, a phenomenon known as aging out. Anything that removes a lot of young men from a population, like a mass enlistment during a war, can also cause a dip in the crime rate. Some criminologists also point to the so-called crack epidemic, or crack wars, of the 1980s and 90s when attempting to explain the big crime rate peak during that time. According to the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency, by the late 1970s, there was a huge glut of cocaine powder being shipped into the United States. This caused the price of powder cocaine to drop by as much as 80%. Faced with dropping prices for their illegal product, drug dealers began converting the powder into crack, a solid form of cocaine that could be smoked. Broken into small chunks or rocks, this form of cocaine could be sold in smaller quantities, to more people at bigger profit. It was cheap, simple to produce, easy to use, and highly profitable for dealers. Use of the drug surged, and by 1985, the number of people who admitted to using cocaine products on a routine basis increased from around 4 million to 5.8 million. There are a number of reasons that the introduction of crack might have led to a spike in crime. Cocaine is a stimulant. Crack created a brief and intense high, as well as a burst of energy, hypersensitivity, and extreme paranoia. Other popular street drugs like heroin were nervous system depressants, more likely to cause lethargy, relaxation, and sleepiness. Also, crack's half-life in the body was a lot shorter. The high was intense, but didn't last as long as that for other street drugs. Once someone became addicted to crack, they'd be crashing and searching for a new fix far more frequently. Crack was also a new drug. Most of the drug distribution trade was controlled by established dealers, gangs, or cartels, men and women whose business relationships and territories were pretty well established. There was violence associated with the trafficking and distribution of drugs like heroin, opium, and powder cocaine, but those markets were, like I said, more settled. Crack created this influx of inexperienced but ambitious and often aggressive young men and women who were essentially newbies to the drug market. Crack was really profitable, and there was a lot of competition for territory, i.e., who got to sell it where, that turned into bloody gun battles. Over time, the street price of crack stabilized and then declined, and the violence associated with turf wars over who sold where stabilized too. A second demographic-related explanation might be called the Roe versus Wade hypothesis. This is one of the most controversial concepts I will cover in this class, but please don't shoot the messenger. Criminologists engage with this theory to try to explain crime declines too. Basically, in 2001, two of the most famous and high-profile economists currently living, John Donahue and Stephen Levitt of Freakonomics fame, published a scholarly paper arguing that, by their calculations, as much as 50% of the drop in the crime rate could be attributable to the nationwide legalization of abortion in 1973. Their argument was threefold. Crime began declining roughly 18 years after abortion was legalized, which is the age at which children who grow up with a predisposition to become engaged in crime will tend to start doing so. The 5 states that allowed abortion as early as 1970 actually experienced earlier crime drops than those that legalized it later, and high abortion states tend to experience sharper crime drops than low abortion states did. Additionally, Canada and the UK, which also experienced a drop in crime at around the same time we did, began legalizing or easing restrictions on abortion at about the same time too, in the late 1960s. There is some brutal logic to this. Family research indicates that children whose parents indicated that they were either wholly accidental or just mistimed tend to receive harsher discipline, less parental warmth, and fewer parental resources, even than their wanted or planned siblings. It may be that some of those unwanted children are just more likely to drop out of school, engage in self-destructive behaviors like heavy drinking and drug use, and become involved in crime as teenagers and adults. Now that Roe v. Wade has been overturned by the Supreme Court, we may start to see differences in crime rates between U.S. states again. If this hypothesis makes you really uncomfortable, it's good to remember one fact. Abortion might not be the only factor in play. The birth control pill was introduced and approved for contraceptive use in 1960. Other kinds of contraceptive technologies began improving at the same time. A new generation of IUD or intrauterine devices, for example, also increased the number of women opting for highly effective long-term contraception, which probably also played some role in reducing the number of unwanted pregnancies. The takeaway here is that allowing people to avoid unwanted pregnancies might have positive ripple effects for society as a whole, and there are other ways to do that. Putting better sex ed in schools and expanding access to contraception come to mind. Supporting struggling young families with better financial and mental health resources so that they can better parent and support their children would also have a positive impact on those children's later quality of life. Wow, that's a lot of different theories to help explain the peak in the crime rate and the fall thereafter. But wait, there's more. I'm just getting started. This one is actually one of my favorites. The lead hypothesis is what we would call a microtheory, something that pinpoints risk at the level of individual biology, or maybe a meso-level theory that looks at how individual factors interact with larger macro-level trends, like levels of atmospheric pollution. Lead is a naturally occurring substance, an element, but just because something is found in nature doesn't mean that it's good for you. Lead began to be more widely used in industrial applications throughout the course of the last century, though it had been a key ingredient in some industry for hundreds of years. For example, lead had been used in certain kinds of paint since at least the Middle Ages. People recognized that adding powdered lead to paint increased its durability, allowed for greater washability, and decreased paint drying time. But people also recognized, since at least the Middle Ages, that lead was potentially very poisonous. Medieval texts noted that working men exposed to high levels of lead tended to suffer seizures, paralysis, and other symptoms of brain and nervous system damage. It was also understood to be especially dangerous to pregnant women and children. Germany passed laws forbidding women and children from working in factories that processed lead in the late 1800s. Lead started to become a greater public health problem in the 1920s when a chemist, shown here, by the name of Thomas Midgley, discovered that adding a lead compound, tetraethyl lead, to gasoline made it burn more smoothly and efficiently in internal combustion car engines. Pretty soon, so-called leaded gasoline was the industry standard. When cars were a luxury item owned by only a few wealthy households, this wasn't as much of a problem. But after World War II, cars became an economic necessity for most households, and lead levels from the burning of leaded gasoline in the air, the water, the soil, and the bodies of adults and children, especially those who lived in cities where the air was more polluted, began to climb. Lead is highly stable, meaning it doesn't decay or go away. Once you have high lead levels in soil, the only thing you can do is bust out the bulldozers and dump trucks, scrape away the affected dirt, and haul it to a secure toxic waste storage facility somewhere. It also doesn't decay in the body either. It's hard for your body to shed lead poisoning once it builds up in your blood or cells, and the long-term effects of that can be extremely detrimental. As the number of cars on the road climbed and lead pollution in the environment went up with it, environmentalists and doctors began raising the alarm and campaigning for restrictions. Industry fought attempts to ban the use of lead and lead compounds in things like paint and gasoline. Thomas Midgley, the chemist who created leaded gasoline, even had a press conference where he poured a bottle of tetraethyl lead all over his hands in an attempt to demonstrate that it was safe. Interestingly, even before pulling that little stunt, Midgley had already needed to seek medical treatment after being diagnosed with severe lead poisoning, so even he understood that the stuff could be toxic. Nevertheless, in the 1970s, after decades of lobbying, the government banned the use of lead in paint and began to dramatically restrict tetraethyl lead in gasoline. Now, the only kind of gasoline you can buy is unleaded gasoline. Then something interesting happened. About 23 years after the phase-out went into effect, we started to see that big drop in crime. Remember, children who were born exposed to criminogenic elements, such as lead poisoning in this case, don't start to age into crime until their teens or young adulthood, and so we would expect to see a lag. This chart superimposes total leaded gas emissions with crime rates 23 years later. Blue is lead emissions, red is crime rates after that lag of 23 years. There's a pretty tight correlation. Moreover, further research found state and regional effects, with states or cities that banned lead emissions earlier showing earlier corresponding drops in the crime rate. The lead-crime connection is pretty simple. We know that lead exposure in utero, infancy, and childhood is linked to impairments in cognitive functioning, specifically brain damage and lower IQ. Having a lower IQ puts an individual at higher risk of committing certain kinds of crime for several reasons. These individuals may have poor impulse control, less ability to evaluate the consequences of their actions, they may be more easily led or manipulated into breaking the law by other people, or they simply might be more likely to get caught. They also tend to struggle in school more. Dropping out of school is a major risk factor for aging into crime because not having a diploma really reduces your opportunities to earn a living through legitimate means. Like other factors, lead could be part of the story without being the whole story. It is another factor that could help to explain the declining crime in other industrialized nations, though, since leaded gasoline and paint were also widely used and then eventually phased out in peer nations at around the same time. It might also be part of what criminologists call a biosocial or dual hazard hypothesis, in which we postulate that biological factors, such as exposure to a neurotoxin like lead, could interact with other risk factors to push the most vulnerable individuals into destructive behavior. One thing the lead hypothesis can also do is help to explain why low-income neighborhoods disproportionately suffer from higher crime, regardless of who lives there, and also why low-income urban neighborhoods have higher crime rates than low-income rural ones, again, regardless of who lives there. When it comes to lead pollution in particular, poor urban neighborhoods have the most of it because they're next to highways, dump sites, and factories that produced it. For example, in studies of soil lead levels in New Orleans, researchers found that the lowest income urban neighborhoods had the highest levels of soil lead, as much as 100 times more in some cases. These were also the highest crime neighborhoods. Because lead is so stable, it doesn't decompose or go away, these areas may still be affected by pollution created decades ago. If lead pollution sounds like something from the past, it isn't. Lead was also commonly used in plumbing. Lots of homes in cities, including those in Texas, still rely on lead pipes to carry our water. This isn't always as dangerous as it sounds because lead is highly stable and doesn't tend to leach or dissolve into the water unless the water is very acidic or the pipes are very old or corroded. In the case of the Flint, Michigan water crisis, that's what happened. Flint, the former site of automobile factories, is now very poor and heavily minority. The city had been buying water from nearby Detroit, but facing budget shortfalls in 2014, switched to pumping in water from the Flint River instead. The water was polluted, though, and highly acidic, and even after it was treated, it began to quickly corrode the city's infrastructure of old lead pipes. Residents knew something was wrong with the water. It stunk, it tasted bad, and it came out of the taps dark brown. That's Flint resident Leanne Waters holding dated samples from her own taps. In addition to the water tasting bad, people began to get sick. Some children, including one of Leanne's sons, were so badly affected they were hospitalized for seizures. Residents knew something was wrong and appealed to the Flint city government, which assured them that the water was safe. Instead, they turned to a local professor who arrived in Flint with some of his grad students to study the water. Lead is pretty simple to test for, and they quickly discovered the problem. In the most heavily affected homes, lead water levels were as high as 25 times what the government recommends, in some cases surpassing the level of lead contamination that gets water officially reclassified as toxic waste. Flint and Michigan officials faced both criminal and civil charges because it came to light that city officials knew the water was dangerous. They had begun shipping in bottled water for their offices and urging employees not to drink the tap water, while still assuring residents of Flint that their water was safe to drink. In 2020, affected residents settled a lawsuit for over $600 million. As of this recording, Flint's old lead pipes have been removed and replaced, but we don't really know what the long-term effects of toxic lead exposure will be on the between 6,000 and 12,000 affected children. Another factor that criminologists point to is something called target hardening. Target hardening is very simply any measure that makes committing a crime more difficult. In the 1990s, only the wealthiest homes could afford any kind of security system. Today, security systems are far more ubiquitous, and most cars come standard with some type of alarm or anti-theft device installed as well. Improvements in forensic investigation techniques and technologies, such as DNA analysis, can also contribute to target hardening if they make crimes easier to solve. And the possibilities continue. As people spend more time on various forms of electronic media, ranging from social media to YouTube and TikTok to video games, we spend less time interacting with other people face to face. A lot of people predicted that the increase in media consumption, combined with an increase in more and more violent entertainment media, would lead to an increase in crime. In fact, we saw the opposite. Turns out people pretty much need to come into contact with someone else to commit most kinds of crime. But we are more socially isolated than ever before. In the past, a lot of working men would leave work at a factory job and head to a bar or pub to blow off steam in the evening. They'd drink, and sometimes they'd get into fights, or stuff would get stolen. Teenagers would get out of school and head someplace to hang out with each other. In my day, it was the mall. Some of them would fight or steal or whatever. Today, more people head straight home and fire up a video game, stream a TV show, or lie on the couch scrolling social media feeds. We spend more of our leisure time alone, or only interacting with each other online. That can be bad for our mental health. Social isolation is a huge risk factor for depression, but it might also have driven down crime. This is an example of the incapacitation effect, something that prevents crime by removing potential criminals from society. In this case, giving bored teenagers something else to do, sticking them at home behind a video game, rather than hanging out at the mall causing problems. Better management of psychiatric and mood disorders is also hypothesized to play some role. In the 1990s, if you suffered from depression, PTSD, or anxiety, you didn't have a lot of treatment options, and some people turned to substances like alcohol to self-medicate. Alcohol is a major contributor to many crimes. Now treatment options have expanded, and people have access to SSRIs like Prozac, mood stabilizers, etc. Kids who might have had problems in school because of conditions like ADHD have more options too. One final controversial theory for why crime may have declined following a peak in the 1990s is the staggering increase in the imprisonment rate. Starting in the 1970s and after, the U.S. began locking up a lot more people, and for longer periods of time. This chart, published in 2020 by the Wisconsin Institute for Research on Poverty, shows this dramatic spike. As you can see, the imprisonment rate kept climbing dramatically, even as crime rates decreased after the mid-1990s. This chart shows the incarceration rate, shown in yellow, compared to the overall violent and property crime rates. You can see the explosive growth in the rate of people the United States was locking up compared to the overall crime rate. It's kind of odd that the number of people in prison just kept going up and up, even though the United States was getting safer. The prison boom in the U.S. is thought to be the result of a number of factors. One was legislative changes. The drug wars and the rapid spike in crime in the 70s, 80s, and 90s freaked a lot of people out, and politicians responded by promising to get tough on crime. President Richard Nixon is credited with launching the war on drugs in 1971 after declaring drug abuse to be America's new public enemy number one. Though the federal government had cracked down on recreational drug use before Nixon and well after, still, Nixon and subsequent administrations, both Republican and Democratic, made fighting drug supply in the United States a priority, devoting more federal resources to expanded policing and incarceration. By 2000, the U.S. drug control budget reached $18.4 billion, nearly half of which was funneled into law enforcement and corrections, and only about 1/6 of which was spent on treatment. Politicians, judges, and DAs tapped into this trend by running for office on Get Tough on Crime platforms, as well as touting records of giving longer and harsher prison sentences than their opponents. Many states, as well as the federal government, also began passing mandatory minimum sentencing laws, taking some of the decision-making power away from judges and how much time individual defendants would serve. 24 states, including California, passed so-called 3 strikes you're out laws. This law mandated longer prison sentences for the commission of an individual's second felony, and mandated that anyone found guilty of a third felony offense would be sentenced to 25 years to life. The California prison population boomed as more people went to prison for longer. Even today, it's estimated that at least a third of California prisoners are currently doing longer sentences because of a 3 strikes you're out enhancement. Another reason the imprisonment rate may have risen was because of an economic trend called deindustrialization. Big changes in the economy, starting in the 1970s, caused catastrophic job losses for millions of Americans. In the 1960s, about 30% of the U.S. workforce worked in manufacturing in some way, either on factory floors as supervisor administrators or in clerical roles in factory offices. The U.S. used to be a major place where things, from cars to clothes to TV sets, were made, but then the factories began to close and move overseas where labor was cheaper. It was more cost-effective to make things in countries like China, Vietnam, or Guatemala and ship them here on big boats instead. American workers lost their jobs in droves, and cities throughout the country, which had once been powered by good-paying manufacturing jobs, fell into ruin around abandoned rusting factories like the former Bethlehem steel plant in Pennsylvania, shown here. Many have never recovered, and today, manufacturing jobs employ less than 10% of U.S. workers. Desperate to put jobless people back to work, cities look for other forms of employment. The war on drugs and the imprisonment boom provided a solution. Towns and cities lobbied for local, state, and federal money to build prisons with out-of-work construction professionals and staff them with guards, nurses, and food service workers and other support staff instead. Prison jobs aren't as well paying as the old factory jobs had been, but a prison does require a lot of people to run it. It's something. But having a brand new prison sitting empty down the road can have an effect on whether prosecutors or judges send convicted people to prison rather than other consequences like probation, and whether parole boards are willing to grant release. Research conducted in 2023 found that, in Florida, for example, from 2004 to 2017, there was an increase in the likelihood of incarceration by about 7 to 10% within the first 9 months after a new prison opened and began accepting inmates. The third factor was a trend called deinstitutionalization. This word looks and sounds like deindustrialization, but it means something different. Before the 60s and 70s, adults with severe mental illness or severe cognitive disabilities were often consigned to inpatient psychiatric hospitals, places that used to be called lunatic asylums or mental hospitals. Such people were warehoused in these institutions for decades, sometimes for life, and often forgotten about by their families. In the 60s and 70s and after, a lot of those old so-called mental hospitals began to shut down and release their former inmates, hence deinstitutionalization. The closure and shuttering of former psychiatric institutions. Deinstitutionalization happened for a couple of reasons. Investigative journalism, academic ethnographies, and in some cases fictional explorations, such as the novel and then movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, of conditions inside so-called insane asylums or mental hospitals began to raise public awareness of the terrible, often abusive conditions inside these facilities. The invention of the first psychotropic drugs in the 1950s, like the antipsychotic Thorazine, allowed for hope that conditions like schizophrenia could be managed effectively enough that the sufferer could live a normal and productive life outside. Finally, changes in federal and state funding for treatment of vulnerable populations. Inpatient care was expensive, and government health and benefit programs weren't really funding it, so hospitals just began to shut down and release everyone. The idea was actually a good one. It was assumed that new treatment programs would open up in communities themselves, that halfway houses would be built where people suffering from mental illness could live affordably, work some kind of job, maybe in a sheltered workplace that would support their challenges, and that these halfway houses would also have nurses and therapists on staff who could support struggling adults, make sure they took their meds, offer them therapy, etc. But that last part never happened, or not enough anyway. Community-based treatment options were expensive, and no one wanted to pay for them. People didn't want halfway houses for mentally ill people being built next to their homes or their kids' schools either. So instead, those vulnerable people were just chucked out of psychiatric institutions and left to fend for themselves. What happened to them? They ended up on the street, and then sometimes in jail or prison. Although people with serious mental illness are thought to be only 4 to 6% of the population, they're around 30% of homeless people, and between 15 to 20% of incarcerated people. And more than half of all imprisoned people have some diagnosed mental illness, or a diagnosed substance abuse issue, or both. Mentally ill people are far more likely to be victims of crimes than perpetrators. Most mentally ill people who end up in prison are not there for committing violent crimes. Usually they get picked up on more minor offenses, trespassing, panhandling, shoplifting, or on parole violations because they can't stick to their release conditions. They may drink or use drugs to self-medicate, or be unable to keep appointments with their parole officers or counselors. In order to be considered to have adequate mental health facilities, a state should have about 50 inpatient psychiatric treatment beds per 100,000 people in the population. No state has that many, but Texas ranked 42nd in the nation, with 8 inpatient treatment beds per 100,000 people in our population. A seriously mentally ill person in Texas is still 8 times more likely to end up in prison than in a mental health facility. So it's not a coincidence that jail and prison populations were spiking around the same time formerly institutionalized people were getting dumped on the street. For a lot of those people, jails and prisons, homeless shelters, and the streets themselves simply replaced psychiatric hospitals for where people with severe problems were warehoused. One other controversial theory for why crime may have declined following the peak in the 1990s is the staggering increase in the imprisonment rate. Starting in the 1970s and after, the U.S. began locking up a lot more people and for longer periods of time, as already discussed. This chart, published in 2020 by the Wisconsin Institute for the Research on Poverty, shows this dramatic spike. And as you can see, the imprisonment rate kept climbing even as crime rates decreased. Some argue that the relationship is simple. When you lock up someone who breaks a law, instead of other alternatives like probation, counseling, job training, etc., that person can't commit most crimes, at least while they're behind bars, and maybe a higher threat of imprisonment acts as a deterrent, keeping other people from doing the same thing. What do you think? Did locking more people up cause crime to fall? Is mass incarceration a reasonable or effective way to fight crime? Some argue that rising prison populations help explain the concurrent decline in crime. Even some of your reading might argue that. But criminologists don't all agree on this point, and this lecture will argue that it did not. That simply locking more people up did not lead to declining crime rates. Let's look at crime rate trends in other countries. The U.S. has a very high rate of imprisonment relative to other industrialized nations, one of the highest in the whole world. This chart shows the U.S. incarceration rate at the top in purple compared to that of other countries. They don't even come close. We did see crime fall as imprisonment rose, but one reason to be skeptical that high imprisonment was a cause is that crime fell not just in the U.S. after the 1990s, but in other countries too, including some like Canada, which did not pursue higher incarceration as a strategy. In fact, no wealthy country locks up as many people as we do, and still do. But again, crime also dropped elsewhere at about the same time. If locking people up caused crime to fall, you'd expect that crime rates in a country like ours, which imprisons a lot of people, to be lower than in peer nations that don't, but we don't see that. We see the same thing at the state level. Some states pursued mass incarceration as a strategy, some did not. But crime rates declined everywhere at relatively similar rates. Also, our incarceration rate as a country is finally starting to fall, but our crime rate keeps going down regardless. It is true that felons can't commit crimes while they are in prison, at least not the ones counted in crime statistics. But mass incarceration can work against that by increasing the recidivism rate after people are released. Recidivism rate basically refers to the number of people who reoffend after being released from prison or jail. This is in large part because having spent time in jail doesn't make you less likely to commit crimes once you get out. It can make you more likely to reoffend. It's extremely hard to get a job once you're released. You've also spent time in prison surrounded by other career felons who spend the time there coaching you on how you can steal again and not get caught next time. Finally, inmates may join gangs inside for protection and continue and spread gang activity in their home communities after they are released. This concludes this lecture. Thank you for listening.